Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we are so thrilled that you can be joining us today. Do want to spend a little bit of time in the first half hour here talking about some of the issues in the news. Want to ask some of those of you in, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, all the way over to Tennessee. Did you find gas today at the gas station, or did you find that your gas station was closed down? We'll get into the fact that if you really are concerned about infrastructure, this is the issue that should be front and center rather than that expensive piece of legislation making its way through Congress right now. So we'll talk about that, and love to know if any of you have been able to find gas and whether it's affected you, and we'll get into some of the facts and figures associated to that. A little bit later, I want to talk about the fact that we have rocket attacks, violent riots, and a number of other conflicts in the Middle East, especially in Israel right now. Try to give a little bit of context to that with the idea that we will postpone some of that conversation to tomorrow, because we'll have Jim Dennison on, and he wrote a very good piece yesterday that I quoted from briefly in the Daily article, so we may get into that in more detail. And I don't know, maybe we get Gary Bauer up there in the next couple of days, Joel Rosenberg, somebody can put some perspective to that. But at the moment, you certainly will be able to have some perspective that I would be glad to give to you in that regard. Just as a program note, let me just mention that about once a year, we like to really focus on the issue of the arts and music and things of that nature. Oftentimes, we've done some programs on art and literature. Today really will be one that sort of came together in terms of music. In about a half an hour, we're going to talk about the value of hymns and how we can, in some respects, learn some great theology from the great hymns. Next hour, we will have Michael Card with us. He was supposed to be with us before talking about his book, The Nazarene, but we were maybe not able to connect up with him, and so he'll be with us on his wonderful book, which is The Nazarene, 40 Devotions on the Lyrical Life of Jesus. And it's broken down into Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We'll actually get just a slight clip from some of those, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what he's done. So if those of you that love music and think music is something that needs to be part of the church, we're going to spend some time today talking about that. But let's first get into the issues in the news. As I shared yesterday, just briefly, the Colonial Pipeline was actually affected and attacked. Cyber attacked is probably the better way to say it, by a group called DarkSide. DarkSide is a group of hackers who use this to, number one, drain data out of the computers, number two, set up what's called ransomware, which then says if you pay our ransom, we'll give you your computers back. And it has been interesting, maybe the better word would be troubling, to see some of the people in the Biden administration that say, well, since it's a private company, we'll let them make that decision. Really? I can't even imagine if this kind of event had happened during the Trump administration. You had a press secretary say that. Kayleigh McEnany saying something like, first of all, I can't even see her saying something like that. Even if they did, the press would just come down like a firestorm saying, well, I don't care if it's a private company. We have people all over the various southeast right now that can't get gasoline. This is a company which is located in Alpharetta, Georgia, and again, about 100 gigabytes of data was taken out. And so what we have been able to find out so far is that this cyber attack was able to shut down the 5,500-mile Colonial Pipeline. I was hoping we'd have Dr. Merrill Matthews on, because he wrote a very good piece that showed up on the Hill saying, well, maybe these are environmentalists actually trying to shut this down, because after all, there have been environmentalists that have said on camera that we'll do anything to shut down the other pipeline, the XL pipeline. But nevertheless, that is the case. It is the longest fuel pipeline in America. Did not know that until yesterday. It transports about 100 million gallons of refined products each day from the Gulf Coast down here in the state of Texas all the way up to as far north, and I did not know this, New York Harbor. So it does supply about half of the fuel on the East Coast. So even though I just mentioned North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, I'm sure that there are some of you in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and other places that have been hit by this as well. The hope is that there was still, because there was a fair amount of fuel storage before the shutdown, the pipeline, they hope, will be back online this week. But meanwhile, gasoline will be transported by trucks, which is less cost effective, less efficient, but nevertheless, something there. You have tankers temporarily storing gasoline on the Gulf Coast with the idea that if this lasted for any length of time, that would be a way to resolve the issue. But love to hear from some of you if you've had a little difficulty finding gas at your local gas station. So you can give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. But let me get on to some other issues because I've posted quite a number of articles here today. And since we are going to be doing a lot on music, we may not get to all the news items until tomorrow. But I did want to also have you see a very good piece that Senator Ted Cruz said about this ongoing debate about the election issue, because you have right now Senate Bill 1. It's the same bill basically as House Resolution 1, which he, in his testimony yesterday, called the Corrupt Politicians Act. He went on to say that this legislation would register millions of illegal aliens to vote. He says that's what it's intended to do. It's intended to do because Democrats have made the decision that millions of illegal aliens voting are likely to vote for Democrats. He says this would register vast numbers of criminals and felons to vote because, again, Democrats have made the decision that criminals and felons are likely to vote for Democrats. Then he goes on and uses some of the same facts and figures we've talked about before because he points out that the legislation, which is being considered right now by the Senate Bill 1, would strike down virtually every voter integrity law at the state level, he says. Those would be the voter ID laws. He says over 70% of Americans support voter ID laws. I've seen the percentage up to as high as 77%, for example. About 60% of African Americans in the country support voter ID laws. 29 states have voter ID laws on the books. Actually, I've got a number higher than that, but I'll use his number since, after all, as a United States Senator, maybe he knows some things I don't. And then he also takes on this issue that the bill would allow ballot harvesting. We actually have a majority of states, I think it's 31 states, prohibit ballot harvesting. Those of you in California might say, well, not in our state. I understand. But nevertheless, this is the practice by which paid operatives handle the ballots of someone else. And in some respects, this has led to all sorts of questionable questions as to whether or not the person was coerced when collecting the ballot, whether or not the ballot harvester was able to see the ballot and decide to throw out ones that maybe were a vote for somebody they disagreed with, and a variety of other issues. And so, if nothing else, the testimony yesterday by Senator Ted Cruz was pretty striking indeed, and that is a piece that is available. It's on his website, it's on the Daily Signal, and a variety of others. But we need to take a break. This will go too fast today, and that's why I said tomorrow we'll talk about it a little bit more. When we come back, I want to talk about also what is happening in Israel. We've posted a piece here that talks about Nikki Haley's response to the tendency to always blame Israel for what's been taking place. And so try to put a little bit of this in perspective. And then, of course, we'll be on with some of our conversations that we're going to have today about the value of music and worship in our churches. And we'll be talking about all of those issues right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A study by the Manhattan Institute explains why it is so hard for middle-class families to make ends meet. The author, Orrin Cass, distilled his research down to a Twitter post. In 1985, he said, the typical male worker could cover a family of four's major expenditures, housing, health care, transportation, education, on 30 weeks' salary. By 2018, it took 53 weeks, which is a problem, there being 52 weeks in a year. Christopher Ingram wrote about this in the Washington Post, saying this chart is the best explanation of middle-class finances you will ever see. The chart shows the annual expenses for a family of four and plots on top of that the median male income. The margin between income and expenses gets smaller each year until the annual household expenses exceed the median male income. The chart in the report helps to explain why families feel the financial pinch. The cost of basic necessities has increased faster than male income. Until recently, we have had a booming economy with a record-setting stock market. But many families are still struggling to bring in enough income to cover housing, health care, transportation, and education. The research focuses on male earnings because historically men were responsible for providing for their families. In the past, they were often the sole breadwinners. Today, they're seen as the primary providers for their family. Horncast concludes that the typical male worker a generation ago could be confident in his ability to provide for his family not only the basics of food, clothing, and shelter, but also the middle-class essentials of a comfortable house, a car, health care, and education. Now he cannot. That is why it has become more and more difficult for families to make ends meet. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the great challenges, especially when we have some great guests coming on, is to try to cover a couple of issues in the news, and you recognize you leave more off than you talk about. So at least as a note, let me just mention that Liz Cheney, who has served as the chair of the House Republican Conference Committee, will no longer do so. She's been in that position for a little over 2 years. Today, the decision was made by the Republican leadership to remove her from that post. Not something that necessarily affects your day-to-day life, and that's why I like to focus on things that affect your faith, your family, or your freedom, but nevertheless did want to acknowledge that. And we do have David French on tomorrow. Maybe he'll make a statement about that, but he's got so many other good articles. I'd like to focus on those things which, again, affect you and your family. Sometimes I get a little tired of who's up and who's down, who's in positions of leadership and all this. We just want Congress to function, and there are a lot of reasons why it's not functioning right now. As another note, since we're getting into the whole question of Israel, let me also mention that Israel today announced, or actually last night announced, that it's killed the Hamas leader, that'd be Ayad Faith Sharir. Excuse me. These are names that aren't necessarily ones that come off the tongue very easily, but nevertheless, the Hamas leader has been killed, and this is all in light of all the things that have been taking place in terms of the various rockets being launched from Hamas, the Gaza Strip, which is oftentimes like a proxy war for Iran, as well as the conflicts that have taken place on the Temple Mount. And as I mentioned just yesterday, you actually had the confluence of a couple of things that explain why some of this is happening. First, you had, of course, Israel, since Sunday, have had what is called the Jerusalem Day. And that is a national holiday that commemorates the reunification of Jerusalem after the 1967 Six-Day War. That is a time in which that part of the country, especially the capital, was controlled by Jordan and indeed was then taken by the Israelis. And so it is something that was celebrated on Sunday with prayer services at the Western Wall. At the same time, coinciding with that was the so-called Night of Power, which is a Muslim celebration of the night when the first verse of the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, supposedly by the angel Gabriel. It is one very sacred night in the Islamic calendar, oftentimes is marked by thousands of Muslims gathering at the mosque on the Temple Mount, which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so, as a result, as the Israelis were celebrating Jerusalem Day on Sunday, Palestinians were throwing rocks at them. The Israeli police raided the mosque where the Palestinians had stockpiled stones. Hundreds of Palestinians were wounded, as well as a number of Israeli police. And of course, you had, as I've just mentioned a minute ago, this militant Palestinian group, which is called Hamas, which rules in Gaza. And it is called for a new intifada, which is basically their word for an uprising. And they have been firing a barrage of rockets into Israel, which, of course, set off air raids. I was sharing off the air with my producer, Steve, that one of the individuals we've had on this program, Paul Baraka, was telling the story of some friends that are in Israel, and they are on one level in this apartment complex. Right beneath them, a Hamas rocket came in and killed the family beneath them. So we can, tell all sorts of stories, and I'm sure as we look at the Israeli attacks of the Palestinians against Gaza and the death and loss of life, of course, you've had so many rushing to the microphone to say that we still support Israel. And then you've had others like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who have been very critical of some of those statements. And a very good piece by Glenn Greenwald about how, isn't it interesting, AOC is very critical of Andrew Yang's statement, who is running for mayor in New York, but the almost identical statement being made by Nancy Pelosi didn't say anything. Well, you don't want to ruffle the feathers too much of the Speaker of the House, but that is certainly another issue. Just before we take a break, this is a complex issue, and I'm sure I will oversimplify it, but one of the big issues also has to do with the argument that Israeli settlements are taking over areas that are held by the Muslims. And I've got this very good piece by Carolyn Glick. We've quoted from her from time to time. I think we've even had her on the program. And it is a place that is a neighborhood which actually has been now taken over by some of the Jewish settlers. And so you have all sorts of statements being made. I'll just post one of those. Senator Elizabeth Warren talked about the forced removal of longtime Palestinian residents of Sheikh Jarrah is abhorrent and unacceptable. But Carolyn Glick in her piece points out that this is not as easy to sort out as you might think. The buildings, according to her, in the neighborhood were purchased by Jewish people 146 years ago, but then they were illegally seized in 1948 when, of course, Jordan and its forces occupied that eastern area, which we have seen. So it's kind of the eastern, northern, and southern part of Jerusalem as part of what was at that time kind of a pan-Arab invasion. Well, during the course of this occupation, the Jordanian registry illegally leased the Jewish-owned buildings to Arabs. Then, when Israel eventually was able to liberate some of those areas, especially around Jerusalem, that's again going back to the 1967 Six-Day War, the owners of the buildings reasserted their rights. After all, they had the buildings, they had a legal deed to those buildings until 1948, and then by the time you get to 1967, they say, well, we are still the owners of the buildings. But, of course, that was something that even the Israelis didn't want to maybe take on right away. But nevertheless, by 1973, that's when you have the next major conflict, you do have these properties as registered in Israel's land registry. So in some respects, you could say that who was the primary owner, who was the squatter. If you ignore what took place before 1967, you could say, well, then the Israelis are taking over buildings that were owned by the Muslims. But if you go back even before 1948, these were buildings owned by Jewish individuals. And so the owners finally have decided to retake possession of this 48-year-old land battle and legal battle between the owners and the squatters. And so, as you can imagine, in every one of these issues with Israel and the Middle East, it's always a little bit more complicated than you might think it to be simply by watching the mainstream press, which is one of the reasons why I posted this article. And in the last few minutes, let me just mention that this is a piece by Reagan McCarthy, taking the time to take kind of a point-counterpoint. The first is a series of statements by Representative Ilhan Omar, who is a Democrat representative of Minnesota, who has actually been very supportive, as you might imagine, as a Muslim, of the Palestinians, and is critical of the Israeli airstrikes in Gaza and a number of other things. And then you see the response that comes from the former UN ambassador Nikki Haley about some of those statements. And Nikki Haley said, quote, "An act of terrorism by Hamas firing rockets in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv is certainly justified." She said, "If a terrorist organization were shooting rockets into the District of Columbia, I doubt you'd have the same response. Israel has a right to defend itself." Not to be outdone, then we also see some of the other quotes from a variety of other people, including John Thune, who is the representative as well, who said Israel has the complete right to defend itself from Hamas rocket attacks. Palestinians in Gaza must reject the futile terrorist cause of Hamas while continuing to block peace for this and future generations. I hope we see an immediate de-escalation, especially at religious sites. And I started by talking about Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney yesterday, even before she was removed from leadership in the Republican Party, also tweeted, "America stands with Israel." If nothing else, for those who are thinking about making a trip to Israel, unless things calm down a little bit, I think the Hamas rockets, the rioting, the ongoing battles are not good news for those in the Israeli tourist business, hoping that some of the tourists from America and other parts of the world coming to Israel, it does kind of cool the enthusiasm. And tomorrow we will spend some time talking with, of course, Jim Dennison about these rocket attacks, about the conflict, about the riots, and just how to think about this from a biblical point of view. When we come back, we're going to talk about, are there values in singing some of these traditional hymns? I think there are, and we'll talk about that with our guests right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Going to spend some time now talking about music, and I don't claim to have a lot of expertise in that regard. I did edit this book, and it is one of the books that we've made available, Arts, Media, and Culture, although I did contribute to some of the chapters, certainly the chapters on art and music. We had other people write them, but it's certainly another aspect of how we as Christians should think biblically about every area of life. And so we are going to spend some time, first of all, talking with Jonathan Aigner about a piece that we've posted that you can read. I think you're going to find very helpful. Next hour, Michael Card will be with us, and we'll be talking about his book, The Nazarene, 40 Devotions on the Lyrical Life of Jesus. And so for those of you that say, gosh, we should talk about music every once in a while and think about this from a biblical point of view, then welcome to the conversation that we're going to have here. Jonathan Aigner, first of all, is the Director of Music Ministries at a PCUSA congregation. He, in the past, has taught elementary music at the public school system, has a Bachelor of Music degree from Baylor University, as well as a Master's of Arts in Theology from Wheaton College, also a Master of Science in Educational Management from the University of Houston Clear Lake, and recently completed a Master of Sacred Music degree at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. And the piece that we have for you to read on our website, Singing Hymns is Better Than Pop Worship. So, Jonathan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
For all of us, especially for me as a neophyte, explain kind of the idea of a hymn, because what you talk about in this article is when you're singing a hymn, you're in a sense singing a poem, and there's a sense in which there is a link between the music, the lyrics, and a variety of other things. And so let's talk about the value of traditional hymns in the first place.
Well, when you're singing a hymn, you are singing poetry. You're singing a piece of. It's not so much a piece of music, but you're singing words that are put together, constructed beautifully. That generally have some kind of a plot to them. It is a strophic kind of sense where one verse gets repeated it comes after another. And it is basically in terms of how it fits in church music and in worship. It is basically you are singing a theological idea that is arranged through a series of stanzas. It's usually, for the most part, self-contained. And the music, the tune is basically chosen. And time was where a hymn could be sung to a lot of different tunes. We've kind of lost that feeling now, but the tune is chosen that is something that is singable. Generally, is not particularly ornate or difficult to be sung. But frames the theological concept with dignity and with beauty, and it allows itself to be sung pretty easily by a congregation.
One of the other things I've said, and again, correct me every time I make a mistake here, but it seems to me that one value of the hymns is they've stood the test of time, and that is those which certainly had resonance with various individuals, those which had good theology are there. As much as I love contemporary Christian music, I wonder if 100 years from now, if the Lord tarries, how many of those songs will be sung in churches. And so there is a sense in which some of the classic traditional hymns are sort of like classical music. You've got a sense in which if it has survived this long, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, whatever, there's probably something worth listening to, in this case, worth singing. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. Completely would agree with that. And I think if you look in any decent hymnal, really, you are going to find a huge variety of influences. You're going to find, it's not just kind of, what is generally thought of as, in 18th, 19th century kind of hymnody. You're going to find translations of ancient Latin hymns. You're going to find translations of German hymns. You're going to find newer hymns that have been written that are, technically, I guess you could call them contemporary of themselves. You're going to find, 20th century gospel hymns and Catholic renewal hymns. You got this huge volume. And as time goes by, hymnody has kind of been a dynamic sort of thing, and it adds the newer things, newer pieces, newer texts to its ranks doesn't necessarily, or usually shouldn't, eliminate the best of what has come before. And I think that is kind of something that we have lost, especially kind of in the evangelical church. We've lost that kind of that connection to these, not just one century or one particular generation, but we've lost this continuing line of good texts that have been sung.
Well, let's, if we can, contrast this with, then, of course, you say singing hymns is better than pop worship. Never really thought about this before, other than the fact that sometimes when we're singing some of these, if you will, pop worship or some of these contemporary songs, after the seventh time we've said the same phrase, I get a little weary of those. But there is, in which you would point out some things, and of course you know more music than many of us, that make it more difficult to sing, make it also, in a way, very different than hymn singing. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, well, basically, I don't like to use the term contemporary because, all worship is contemporary because we're doing it now.
Sure.
That's why I've used the term pop, basically, because it is dependent upon pop styles of music that are current, that are marketable, and that make money basically now. And what those are, they are pieces that are created to be sung by an individual or by a group, that are meant to be recorded or meant to be sung in a live performance. They aren't really written necessarily with an eye to the text, especially. They are not really necessarily written in mind for a congregation to be singing. And so what you end up getting in these kind of pop concert style singing, you get people may or may not be singing along, but the people in the pews that are singing, or the chairs that are singing along, are kind of incidental to the whole thing. The main performance is going on up on a platform. You've got people singing a song that is written for individual, stylistic singing, performance singing. And people are singing along with that, kind of much like they might be doing at a pop concert somewhere, just with different words. That's one thing that I've noticed.
Let me just mention, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I mean, we're not going to necessarily go through the whole worship wars again, but one of the things that you talk about, Jonathan, is the argument that's constantly made that, well, if we don't have what, again, we call pop worship, then we're going to lose the younger generation. And one of the lines that you have in there is pretty interesting. If indeed you are concerned about the churches shrinking in numbers, and some indeed are, attendance is declining in many churches. That has been the case. The only way is to reach out to younger people, but you said the strategy is 50 years old. So is that working? And what I find so intriguing is that sometimes the younger generation, about every other week we have a millennial roundtable here, and off the air, we've never talked about it on air, but off air I've sometimes asked, what church you go to, and some of them go to these liturgical churches. They like singing the hymns, and so it's kind of like, well, that's a surprise, because everybody's been telling us that it's got to be pop, it's got to be with the lights, it's got to be with guitars, drums, and everything in order to attract the young people, but sometimes they seem to be looking for something else.
Exactly. I mean, I'm one of those. I grew up in a contemporary style megachurch, and I never really bought into the whole thing, and have kind of put words to those feelings as I've gone on. And in my experience, professionally and personally, what I have seen is that the voices that are most loudly calling for the pop worship, the contemporary worship, are not the younger generations. And I don't want to disparage any one generation in particular, but when it's those 50s and 60s who are calling for it, I don't hear those same kind of the same kind of arguments coming from people more my age and younger. I just don't. I don't think the point of corporate worship or liturgy is to evangelize in that sense, to attract people, like an evangelistic kind of revival meeting or something. That to me does not really jive with sort of the historic understanding of Christian worship. But, to that point, it doesn't really seem to be working to me. And I think that has been a mistake that we've been far too long in really acknowledging.
Let's take a break, and then when we come back, if you'd like to join the conversation, ask a question, make a comment, Jonathan Aigner with us, and I just thought this would be a good conversation about the value of traditional hymns, the value of hymn singing generally, and this was a piece that was posted, and it is on our website, pointofview.net. That, I think, will give you a chance to kind of understand his entire argument. It goes on for 3 pages, and I've only just sort of dipped into it. We'll come back and get into it in a little more detail, and we'll give some of you, if they have a comment or a question, a chance to interact with that as well. Next hour, Michael Card with us as we talk about his book, The Nazarene, 40 Devotions on the Lyrical Life of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We'll talk about that soon, right after these messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back again with Jonathan Aigner. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Got a number of calls. We'll get to those in just a minute. I thought I'd put one other issue on the table, Jonathan, and that is, I've taught at seminaries occasionally. I've been in ministry for 45 years. Most of my adult life, I've been teaching Sunday school classes. So, I've spent a fair amount of time out of necessity reading theological books. That being said, I'd still have to say that a very significant portion of my theology has come from the great hymns that I've learned as well. And if you go back in time in church history when people weren't as literate, sometimes the way you did communicate God's word was through some of these great musical scores and hymns.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to kind of the historic sort of understanding of Christian worship, that it is formative. And I think that is one of those things when you hear the thing, and hopefully it is, primarily scripture and things like that are doing the forming, but also the things, the hymns and different things that you repeat over and over again, those things do become a part of you. And if they are good, if they have some theological depth to them, then that is a great benefit.
Let's take some phone calls. We'll head out first to New Hampshire. Donna, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Jonathan Aigner.
Wow, that was quick.
Yes. Well, I thought I'd get to you first. I'm going to get to some others in a minute, but I saw yours pop up, and I think you have very good suggestions. So what would you like to add?
And listen, the hymns are my most favorite, and they will never die, because a lot of them were Holy Spirit led. But anyway, my idea is I attend a different church than my own, but it is a Christian church. And when they sing the hymns, they sing it a little faster than normal. And it makes it really come alive, and it makes it fun. Like the song Love Lifted Me, when they get to the word lifted, everybody in the congregation are up on their toes and back down.
So,
for the word lifted.
Yeah, changing the tempo. What about that, Jonathan? Any thoughts?
Well, I think that can be something that needs to be done sometimes. There's an understanding, I think, among some, and it probably just has more to do with the way, experiences that were maybe less than ideal, that hymns are always have to be done slowly, or, dirge-like or something like that. And I think it's important to realize.
That's a good point.
Yeah, those are the words that I hear, and that's
and sometimes the camp songs were that way. I've spoken a lot of Christian camps all over the country, and so sometimes that's been the case. But let's take some more phone calls, because I have quite a number of callers I'd like to interact with you. So we'll go to California this time. Abigail, you're on with Jonathan Aigner.
Hi there.
Yes, what would you like to add?
I go to a Baptist church, not for any reason other than the fact that they preach the Bible, and I definitely don't like the songs that they choose to sing now, but I am an old hymn person. I love the old hymns. I have old hymns at home, old hymnals at home, so that I can always sing them when I want to, because I believe that they move the Spirit. I really do. I believe they bring down God's anointing. I believe that they are very strongly spiritual songs.
Well, I think so. And as I said before, Jonathan, I got a feeling that, if the Lord does not return anytime soon, of course, in light of all the things that happen in the Middle East, we don't know. But if 100 years from now, churches are singing, I think some of those hymns will stay around, and some of the contemporary music that everybody's singing every day will have been forgotten. And so there is a sense in which the test of time is important. She brought up something I thought I'd ask about, because we've been talking about substance and style, but another part of style is, and this may be controversial as well, I've heard some individuals who are worship leaders, and certainly you've been involved in that as the director of ministry, that when they went from sometimes singing from the hymns to putting the notes up on the screen with PowerPoint or something like that, the people were looking up and singing out versus, again, we've taught to actually hold the hymnals up, but we know most people hold them down, and that kind of changed kind of some of the reaction there as well to singing the hymns, because everybody's looking forward and everybody's singing out towards the congregation and towards the front. What are your thoughts?
I've heard that before. My experience has been completely the opposite, actually.
Well, I wanted to hear what you had to say. Yeah.
Well, generally, it's just, it turns from being, you can sing down into your hymnal, but if you're holding the hymnal up a little bit and singing out, that helps. A lot of times the screens are put up at an angle where your neck is craned. It makes it difficult to sing. And it also kind of, I don't know, something about having the physical book there. It anchors you. It is an anchor for the memory as well.
Yes. It's like
that
having
has been
your Bible.
My experience.
Yeah, you
and
can
I'm sure that
you can have a Bible in your smartphone, but it's different than holding a Bible. And same thing, holding a hymnal. Go ahead.
And the transience of words on a screen. They're here 1 minute, they're gone the next. I mean, to me, that is kind of symbolic.
Probably is. One thing I love about the hymns is sometimes you can learn some history because you look down there and see who wrote it and who did the music for it and all sorts of other things. Sometimes they will even have a little note about why it was written in the first place. But I'm going to keep going because we got some other calls. So we'll go to Georgia this time. Shelby, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Yes, I think the hymnals are very spiritual, but I called because my daughter, she's in her late 20s, and she's been looking for a church more traditional instead of this highlighting and high rush thing. And she's just looking for the old-fashioned church.
And, I think I'm starting to see more and more of that, Jonathan. So let me get your thoughts about that, because the argument that you make in the article is that we have to make this all kind of pop and contemporary, back to that key word and all that, and that's going to attract the young people. But we've been doing that for, almost 5 decades now. How's it working for you, to use an old question? So what about that?
I don't see it working well. Actually, I hear stories about this all the time. Especially, from younger people, from people of every age. Really, I go to the church I do because there's biblical preaching and those sorts of things, which is I'm not at all saying is not important, but there's always that kind of concession there. But I really, I wish the music and the ethos of worship was more reverent, more the way maybe I remember it, or I hear that all the time. Now,
one of the things I might just mention is this is just one article that was in Pathos. So again, people can follow that, but we do have a link there to the article itself. We also have a link to your website, and so that is a place where they can find not only this article, but other articles. And I got a feeling you're going to be writing about this on a pretty regular basis. So I really appreciate you giving us some time to talk about this. But if other people would like to connect with you off screen or off of the air, how could they do so?
They can find me at my blog. I have an email address listed there, or they can leave comments. That's probably the easiest way. And sometimes I just get a few, and I'm able to respond. Other times it can be kind of overwhelming, but I do like to hear from people.
Well, and given the fact that we're on a national program here, you may get more emails than you want. But nevertheless, I really appreciate you, first of all, writing the article. Thank you for being willing to express your opinion. And if nothing else, it was just a great lead into the conversation we're going to have in a few minutes with Michael Card. So, Jonathan, thank you for joining us, and let's try to do it again sometime.
Sounds great. Thank you very much for having me.
Let's take a break, and I did not get to all your phone calls. Some of those, if they are appropriate to the conversation with Michael Card, will certainly be the case. He has this book out, which is entitled The Nazarene, 40 Devotions on the Lyrical Life of Jesus. Now, each one of the sections is broken down to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so it's been easy to follow there. And on a couple of these cases, when we come back from a break, we will play just a short clip from one of the musical pieces that he's put together. And if nothing else, I think that will also be an encouragement to you as we focus on the subject of music from a biblical point of view. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time again talking about the subject of music. And in this particular case, we really want you to kind of listen, really kind of even listen very intently to the life of Jesus, and to really begin to pick up some of the thoughts that are put together in this book, but also in the music by Michael Card. The book is The Nazarene, 40 Devotions on the Lyrical Life of Jesus. We have information about him and the book on our website. Michael Card, he's been with us, but it's been a long time since we've had him on. Recorded, I think it's 31 different albums, authored or co-authored more than 24 different books. An author, a musician, a performing artist, maybe best known for some like El Shaddai and Emmanuel, but also books like Scribbling in the Sand, Fragile Stone, Inexpressible. Also written the Biblical Imagination series, a graduate of Western Kentucky University, both with a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. I remember you studied with Dr. Ron Nash and other people of that nature. And Michael Card, welcome back to Point of View. It's been a long time.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
Let's, if we can, as we go through this hour, kind of break it into four, because that's how you broke your book into four, and that is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But before we get into that, can you explain kind of this idea of the lyrical life of the Nazarene? Because in some respects you say these are bits and pieces and fragments that all have come together in this book, in which you've really tried to set to music and to, if you will, poetry, the various aspects of the life of Jesus.
Yeah, people keep asking me that question, and I'm still working on the answer. What does it mean? What does lyrical life mean? It means that the truth of his life can, I want to say, best be expressed in lyrics, but that's probably saying too much. Lyrics are a wonderful way to express the truth of the life of Jesus of Nazareth, in that in order to write a lyric, it has to be condensed, it has to rhyme, it has to fit together in a certain way that it just puts the burden of proof on the writer. If you can say something true lyrically, I just think it communicates in a different way. I want to say better, but I won't say that. I really want to say better. But it really does communicate truth in a unique way. Let's use that word. It communicates the truth of who he is in a unique way, because his life is lyrical. Yes. I mean, it's poetic and it's beautiful, and it in one sense, it fits together. And even when there are those discords, there's something musical about his life.
So let's, if we can, maybe kind of break it down into the four. The first one is Matthew, and of course, tax collector. I love how you start out by sits in the back corner of a synagogue collecting ideas. And of course, if people have been watching the TV program The Chosen, we had Jerry Jenkins on. Of course, his son Dallas Jenkins has been doing that. They have Matthew as a real obsessive kind of individual, as a tax collector collecting sayings and those kinds of things. But nevertheless, in this first whole section here, you have a number of musical pieces that you've put together that focus on everything from who he is to his humanity to, of course, Matthew writing to a Jewish audience trying to explain who he was as the Messiah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the actor that portrays Matthew, the liberties, and nobody's going to be harder on a presentation of the life of Jesus than me. But The Chosen, they have done a wonderful, I think they've done a wonderful job. And the little quirky guy who plays Matthew, I just love that guy.
I know.
But Matthew is a person. I mean, I think obviously he's a bit of an outsider. He would have been viewed as a traitor, obviously, because he allied himself with the Romans. But everything that you would expect from a tax collector, you get in Matthew. You get that genealogy, which that was part of their job as tax collectors, were genealogical records. And he's really good at listing things. Listing the sayings of Jesus, especially. He doesn't especially put them in their context the way Luke does, but he has lists of the sayings of Jesus, and he was apparently based in Galilee. We call Matthew the Gospel of Galilee. He's very interested in Galilee. I just read through Matthew again yesterday, and all over again I realized how interested he is in Jesus moving in and out of Galilee.
Well, in one of your sections, chapter 3 is on the beauty of Galilee and the fact that it's a very significant place for those of us that have traveled to Israel, or for some of our listeners that have joined with us. You can get a sense of what the Sea of Galilee looks like, and what the whole area looks like, and what Capernaum probably looked like, and what it was probably like to have lived there. But nevertheless, you are in that section really trying to pick out a couple of themes. One I just alluded to, and that is his humanity. But another theme that runs through Matthew is the kingdom, and that is, I think, the 10th chapter of your book, because in some respects that's kind of the capstone of all of the other things in the Gospel of Matthew, isn't it?
It really is, and what you have to realize is that and Jesus thinks in Hebrew, so he thinks in verbs. We think in English, and Greek people also, people who spoke Greek in Jesus' day, they think in nouns. And so when Jesus says the kingdom of God, what he really is meaning is the reign of God. Mm-hmm. It's more of a verb than a kingdom with borders and that sort of thing. So when he talks about the eternal kingdom, he means that the reign of God is going to last forever. When he announces the good news that the kingdom has come, what he means is the reign of God has begun. And Matthew is very he, even though he's somewhat of a traitor, he thinks as thoroughly as a Jewish man. He substantiates everything substantiates everything with quotations from the Hebrew Bible. I mean, Jesus moves to Nazareth, and Matthew quotes the verse, because he was a Nazarene. That's why he moved to Nazareth. So one of the things I really love is the way every little detail, I mean, the Bible is accurate when it doesn't even know it's being accurate. The portrayal of someone like Matthew and what he's interested in and how he perceives Jesus. And you can do this with all four Gospels. It is so consistent. And I think that's part of the perfection. I think the Gospels are perfect. And I think that's part of its perfection.
Very good. Let's take a break, and we will continue our conversation with Michael Card. Let me just mention a couple of things that we have on our website. First of all, we have a link to his website, michaelcard.com. You can find that there. This book, of course, you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. It is published by our friends at InterVarsity Press. It's called The Nazarene, 40 Devotions on the Lyrical Life of Jesus. And I might just mention that we will, when we come back, have a chance to hear just a very short musical clip. But if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to find the book, but I couldn't find it in the bookstore, or I'd like to order it now, it's available both in paperback and Kindle. And I'll talk about some of the other resources that are available through Michael Card as well. But we have all of that listed on the website, and we're going to come back and hear just a piece of music. Then we'll get into the Gospel of Mark, which is the second part, and then we'll go to Luke and John. So I hope you're enjoying the conversation today as we focus on the lyrical life of Jesus. And we'll have more to talk about on that score right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A study by the Manhattan Institute explains why it is so hard for middle-class families to make ends meet. The author, Orrin Cass, distilled his research down to a Twitter post. In 1985, he said, the typical male worker could cover a family of four's major expenditures, housing, health care, transportation, education, on 30 weeks' salary. By 2018, it took 53 weeks, which is a problem, there being 52 weeks in a year. Christopher Ingram wrote about this in the Washington Post, saying this chart is the best explanation of middle-class finances you will ever see. The chart shows the annual expenses for a family of four and plots on top of that the median male income. The margin between income and expenses gets smaller each year until the annual household expenses exceed the median male income. The chart in the report helps to explain why families feel the financial pinch. The cost of basic necessities has increased faster than male income. Until recently, we have had a booming economy with a record-setting stock market. But many families are still struggling to bring in enough income to cover housing, health care, transportation, and education. The research focuses on male earnings because historically men were responsible for providing for their families. In the past, they were often the sole breadwinners. Today, they're seen as the primary providers for their family. Orrin Cass concludes that the typical male worker a generation ago could be confident in his ability to provide for his family not only the basics of food, clothing, and shelter, but also the middle-class essentials of a comfortable house, a car, health care, and education. Now he cannot. That is why it has become more and more difficult for families to make ends meet. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
The Nazarene had come to live the life of every man, and he felt the fascination of the stars. And as he wandered through this weary world, he wondered and he wept, for there were so few to listen to his call.
Just a little bit of music from Michael Card on the Nazarene, 40 devotions on the lyrical life of Jesus. And each segment we return, Michael, we thought we'd just play a little bit so people can get a sense of that. But the good news is if people want to actually follow along with what is written, there are some ways that you can connect them up to some of that music, isn't there?
There's all kinds of ways. I mean, in this day and age, you know, we've got Spotify and iTunes and all. I think that don't you think the days of CDs is virtually gone? I mean,
I know I'm just an old guy with CDs, but that's right. It's all digital now, and it was digital back then, but it really is. So again, there are just all sorts of ways in which people could connect up with that. And by the way, if some of you want to join us, I know there are even some calls left over from the last hour. After we maybe cover another section here, we'll start taking some phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. But I did want to get to part 2, which is the Gospel of Mark. You call that the beginning of the gospel, and I love this. You imagine him as kind of a young, impressionable individual sitting at the feet of Peter, and in some respects, that's the whole beginning of the gospel. You begin to talk about some of the things that were so instrumental in that particular gospel, but again, you try to help us see maybe a little different angle of Jesus through the light and through the eyes of Mark.
Yeah. Well, the beginning. It's the beginning of the gospel because it's almost certainly the first gospel that was written.
Yes.
All the church fathers going back to the 2nd century say it's the background of the gospel. Mark is Peter. Mark is a disciple of Peter. Peter refers to him as my son. And even I don't know if Mark is my favorite gospel, but I think Mark is my favorite gospel writer. Because if you think of this young man, probably 14, 15 years old, I mean, he's the nephew of Barnabas. I mean, come on, Barnabas. Jesus and his disciples apparently meet in their home in Jerusalem. His mother is Mary, and I think a case can be made for the fact that the Lord's Supper actually happened in Mark's house. But they were meeting there praying, when Peter was in prison. So, I think Mark must have been an extraordinary and just an incredibly privileged young man. And what we read, and I think it's Clement of Alexandria, says that the early church came to Mark, who was the disciple of Peter, and they said, please write down Peter's story or Peter's account of the life of Jesus. And so what we have in the Gospel of Mark is Peter really telling Jesus' closest friend, telling about the life of Jesus. And the disciples are referred to as Peter and his companions. So things like that are really interesting.
Well, again, one of the things that's so intriguing, as you point out here, is that it is tied to Peter in such very significant ways. And you even talk about the gospel really centers around two confessions, the confession of Peter in Caesarea Philippi, where we've taken some of our listeners in the past, and then the confession of the centurion who crucified Jesus. So in some respects, you tie those in together. But Caesarea Philippi, just let's remind people, if they're not familiar, was really a very pagan area. They're standing probably very near the temple of this god Pan in a cave, which was thought to be the entrance of hell or Hades. And so when you have that very powerful statement that the gates of hell will not prevail, in the midst of all that, you can see how this is, again, if you will, Peter's confession in the Gospel of Mark. And so later when you read 1st and 2nd Peter, those are just footnotes to everything that's in the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah, and I think, I get this from William Lane. Bill's commentary talks about the fact that Jesus, first of all, you've got to ask yourself, why does Jesus take them? It's 25 miles north up to Caesarea Philippi. What in the world is he doing taking them up there? And Bill's answer was he wanted that confession to take place in the face of raw paganism, because it's not just the temple of Pan. There's the temple of the dancing goats. You've been there. You've seen all those things. Later, there was a temple to Augustus there. It is raw paganism. And in the face of paganism, Peter makes that confession. And I think you're right. I think Jesus, just when he says the gates of hell will prevail against it, I think he's pointing at the cave of Pan when he says that.
I think he probably was too. They may have just been in the very presence of it. And then, of course, most of us, until you travel there, you don't realize, why does Jesus talk about the gates of hell? Because that was supposed to be the gates to hell. So you can understand that context very well. Let me move on to another one, because you also talk about the service of the sod, or the idea that the seed is scattered, it is sown, though it has a power of its own. The sower casts it all around. It falls upon the fallow ground. Very important and a very significant set of stories and parables that Jesus used so often to try to emphasize the gospel.
Yeah, and in Mark, that's the only parable he explains to the disciples. He takes them aside, gives a parable, and then takes them aside and explains, this is what the seed is, this is what the soil is. And the timing of it is perfect, because he's about to send them out to do just that, to spread the gospel, to spread the seed, the good news that the kingdom has come, and that the King, Jesus, has arrived, in essence, that the reign of God has begun.
One other point I wanted to bring up, and this one I think is even more significant in light of what we've been through last year, your piece on You Walk in Lonely Places. Now, I've done a booklet here on loneliness, and loneliness is something I wrote about 25 years ago in a book, Crisis of Loneliness, but it's gotten only worse, especially during the pandemic and the lockdown. And if nothing else, I'd never thought about it until you wrote this, that we do get a hint of the loneliness of Jesus choices. You could say, well, I could go to the Garden of Gethsemane, but you instead take in which he hears the death of his cousin John the Baptist and takes the disciples into the wilderness and those kinds of things. And there is a sense in which even there you can see not only the pain of Jesus, but the loneliness of Jesus. And maybe that would be a comfort to so many that have had such a lonely experience this last year.
Well, and again, I think that's Peter. That's connected to Peter, because who is in touch more with the emotional life of Jesus more than Peter? So you see him, he's moved with compassion. He gets angry. He's angry in the Gospel of Mark, and then he looks around at anger at one point in chapter 3, and he warns people, and he gives strict orders at one point. He gives a deep sigh in chapter 7. When he's, just so put out with everybody. And he's always rebuking Peter. He's deeply grieved. He's indignant. He's just far more emotional. I think there are 15 references to his emotions. Mm-hmm. And in a big gospel like John, there's only 4 references to his emotional life. But in a little short gospel like Mark, there's 15 references. So, yeah, I think he's far more emotional in Mark than any of the other Gospels, and I think that's because Peter.
Well, again, just some great insights there. Finally, you just talk a little bit about this idea of the paradigm and this idea that he is poor, he is blind, he will be a paradigm, one of Jesus' greatest finds there beside the road, calling out he has the nerve to what he does and does not deserve. An important point there as well in the Gospel of Mark, isn't it?
Yeah, that's Bartimaeus. And Mark, I think in a lot of ways, I'll say something that's over the top. In one sense, the Gospel of Mark is really all about Bartimaeus because the action of the Gospel sort of rises to Jesus encountering this blind person who says to Jesus something Jesus has been waiting for 3 years to hear. He says, I want to see.
Yes.
I think Jesus has been waiting to hear somebody say that. And then as far as we know, Bartimaeus becomes a disciple. Jesus obviously opens his eyes, and he follows Jesus into Jerusalem. So when Jesus enters Jerusalem, he's got Lazarus. He's got a dead guy on one side and a blind guy on the other side. I think it's a pretty stunning instance.
That's a great illustration. Well, we need to take another one of those breaks. When we come back, we'll focus on Luke. And then let me open up some phones. We already have some waiting, but if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to make a comment, ask a question of Michael Card, observations. We've been talking about music. That is the case. But we'll start and talk a little bit about Luke, and certainly a very significant individual as well. A doctor, an individual that first was an outside observer, but that he went from they to we. We'll talk about that in the book of Acts, and how the world was turned upside down. But if you'd like to join the conversation as well, we certainly welcome that. 1-800-351-1212. The book is called The Nazarene, 40 Devotions on the Lyrical Life of Jesus. Michael Card is our guest, and will continue with us, but we might take some of your phone calls too. 1-800-351-1212. All the information we're talking about today can be found at our website, pointofview.net, and we'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
I've seen your salvation. He's the light of the Gentiles, and the glory of his people is real.
Once again, talking with Michael Card. The Nazarene is the book, and wanted you to hear just some of the music. And, of course, you can find that in a number of different ways. Let me take some phone calls in just a minute, 1-800-351-1212. But at least to set up the fact that we are talking now about Part 3 and Luke. As I mentioned just a minute ago, you see in the Gospel, if you will, that certainly Luke is looking at that from a bit of an observation. But then, interesting enough, you point out that by the time you get to Acts 16, and I've always said Luke is part 1, Acts is part 2, you see this remarkable shift from they all of a sudden to we, and you begin to see him actually being part of the advancement of the gospel. And you titled this whole section, A World Turned Upside Down, and that's one of your musical pieces on that regard.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you look at that passage in Acts, there's this strange things that happen. They're wanting to go, I think, north, and it says the Holy Spirit stops them. Yes. And then they want to go in another direction. I don't remember, east or south or something. And it says the Spirit of Jesus stops them. And there's nothing like that anywhere else in Acts. And you read that and you go, what in the world is going on? And what's going on is they are being funneled to Troas. And Troas is, you mentioned it changing from we to they. Troas is where that changes. And so the idea is that's where they meet Luke. And so Luke joins them, and obviously he's a companion of Paul. And whereas Mark is really kind of, in one sense, the Gospel of Peter, Luke is the Gospel of Paul. He quotes Paul, he refers to Paul. Mm-hmm. He's concerned with the universality of the gospel to the Gentiles. Luke is very interested in that, and I think that's reflective of Paul. So I love all of these connections that these writers of the Gospels are real life people who are connected to people, and one of the I'm sorry, I'm getting a lot excited.
It's good.
But Luke. One of the interesting things about Luke is I think 1:1, he says he refers to the fact he's not an eyewitness. So he is interviewing eyewitnesses, and through the Holy Spirit, he is choosing which, eyewitness testimony he uses. And I'm assuming that there's some eyewitness testimony that he wrote down that he didn't use. So he's talking to all these people who actually saw and knew Jesus 30 years or so after, Jesus had been resurrected.
And so, again, there are some great elements in that. But let me take some phone calls along the way. If you'd like to make a comment or focus on the subject of music, or maybe have been influenced by Michael Card, love to hear from you. We'll head to Georgia first. Carrie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Carrie?
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wanting to comment on the music thing, talking about what's going on with maybe the contemporary church. Like they're trying to make the atmosphere happen rather than lead people into that place of worship with the smoke, the light, and a new song almost every week. So how they're ever going to get one that really is like a hymn when they keep changing new songs? And it's almost like the churches get together and see what's the latest fad, and then they all implement it.
Good point. Again, it's back to what you just said a minute ago, Michael, about the Holy Spirit. There is a sense in which we go to worship with the expectation of meeting God and coming into the presence of God. Sometimes it works better than others, but it isn't something that can be easily contrived. And I'd love to get your thoughts about that just before we move on.
Well, I think what the caller was referring to is the fact, and I struggle with this too, is that what we've done is we've borrowed this model from the world that is really kind of a concert model.
Yes.
I actually saw a thing on Instagram or Facebook the other day, and someone had a picture of the worship band, and it was like he said, there was smoke and all those lights. I know I'm starting to sound like my father, but But
yes,
the caption said, "You know, it's going to be a really good service when they start off with Pink Floyd." And I thought to myself, what in the world is going on? And so what I think we've done, we borrowed this concert model, and that's not an appropriate model. Dr. Lane, my mentor, used to say, you know, initially the altar was in the middle when the Catholicism was sort of predominant, and the Reformation happened, and we moved the altar back, and we put the pulpit in the middle. It became all about the sermon. And then what's happened in our time, we moved the pulpit out of the middle, and we put the drum set in the middle, and it's all about the music. And and I'm a musician. I guess I'm part of the problem, but I don't think that's how it's supposed to work. I think you lead sheep. Sheep are led, and I think music that's appropriate leads us into worship. It doesn't drive us into it. I don't know if that makes any sense or not.
It does. And again, you can say that as a musician because, again, what is front and center? Obviously, you want the scriptures to be front and center, God to be front and center, but we know how that gets violated every single day. So, Kerry, thank you for starting that conversation. We'll take another phone call in just a minute, 1-800-351-1212. But when we talk about Luke, he's a doctor, and because of that, we get the nativity. And it was striking to me that a couple of your chapters dealt with, for example, Luke 1, what sort of a song? Luke chapter 2, the king in a cattle trough, and then a Simeon song, number 3. So there's a sense in which you have quite a number of focus in this particular section on the nativity, the birth, and the dedication of Jesus, because in some respects, that's one of the things we always have come to expect from Luke, because after all, those are the gospel verses we tend to read most often at Christmas time.
Yeah, and here's the really cool part. You remember back, okay, Luke's not an eyewitness. He speaks to eyewitnesses. And you read those nativity accounts and ask yourself, well, who's his eyewitness? And you read those closely, and he knows what Mary is thinking and feeling. I believe he actually spoke to Mary.
Had to have.
And that she was his source. Because, you know, you read the accounts, and Joseph never opens his mouth. Mary is the one who does all the talking, because I think Luke actually spoke to her. And I think that just makes it amazing.
I think so, too. A couple others. There's a theme running through Luke in terms of being the servant. How much more a servant could he be? And then also a section here on the pain and persistence of doubt, which I thought was very powerful as well. Can you speak to those issues?
Yeah, I think, again, that's probably something, as he's interviewing eyewitnesses, you know, we have this, we don't listen closely enough to the Gospels. The statement is made that even at the ascension, as they are watching Jesus ascend into heaven, it says many believed, but some doubted.
Yes.
In John 21, when they're standing beside Jesus around the Sea of Galilee after the resurrection, he seeks breakfast for them. There's some there who aren't really sure that it's him. And so from that I get this theme. There's this persistence of doubt. And I think that Luke got that from talking to eyewitnesses. There were people that still struggled. Did this really happen? I mean, it's such, you know, God in human flesh coming into the world. You know, that is such a huge, if that's really true, then nothing else really matters.
And again, it's something that we talk about so often here on Point of View. Yesterday, for example, we did a whole program on the whole issue of apologetics, how to defend the Christian faith. And a part of it was to actually equip our listeners to know how to share the gospel or answer questions from the skeptics. But I also went back and said, but let's just face it, that even for the Christians living in a world that is assaulting our faith, there is that pain and persistence of doubt that you talk about. Yes. And so there's a real need to not only provide the apologetic answers for those who are asking tough questions, but for the sense of nagging, maybe subliminal doubt that so many believers have. And it's interesting that Luke kind of emphasizes that. And you spent some time, obviously, talking about that as well. And, of course, that's in the Gospel of Luke. Let's take a break, though. We certainly have one more to cover, and that is John, the misunderstood Messiah, is the one there. And, of course, we are so familiar with so many of the things that John talks about in his Gospel. And at the same time, we can get into a couple other aspects of what you will find in the book, The Nazarene, published by InterVarsity Press, 40 Devotions on the Lyrical Life of Jesus. We might take another phone call, too, if we have some time. And we are privileged to be talking today with Michael Card. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know more about him, we have a link to his website, michaelcard.com. Of course, you can go there directly, find more about this book, see some of the videos, find some of the other great resources there. And, of course, if you can't find the book in your local bookstore, we have a link so you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. We will take a break and continue our conversation with Michael Card right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
A man was born in darkness, and the blame they could not qualify. The one who said, I am the light, restored the sight to blinded eyes. He was the broken bread of life of all the world, the light.
Again, talking talking with Michael Card and the Nazarene, and one of the things that actually you will find in this particular section as we talk about John. Let me just mention, too, before we're done, that there's an appendix that gives you kind of a musical overview of the Bible, the various songs by Michael Card, the albums they come from, and so both in the Hebrew Bible as well as in the Gospels and in the Acts, Epistles, and Revelation, you can find all of that. There's lyrics, musical credits, and much, much more. But as we wind down, let's, if we can, talk about the Gospel of John. And you take us to his old age. We think of John as being kind of a young teenager, full of enthusiasm, but you remind us that there was a time when Peter had been dead for probably 30 years, and he is the last remaining disciple of Jesus. And that was a great illustration that you used there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Eusebius says that John lives into the time of Trajan, and that's 98.
Yeah.
And we think that he writes his gospel around 100. So he's 90 to 100 years old. And, back in those days, the average, people died around 30 or 40. And we see in the end, in chapter 21, he lives to be so old that this rumor starts that he's not going to die till Jesus comes back. And the interesting thing, I don't know if you remember who was the guy who sang with Billy Graham. You know what I'm talking about. The big guy who used to sing at all the crusades. He lived to be 103. What is his name? George Beverly Shea.
George Beverly Shea. They almost came up at the same time he did.
There was a rumor.
Yeah.
There was a rumor that because he lived so long, 103, a rumor started that Jesus was going to come back before George Beverly Shea died. Exactly the
same story. That's right. Yeah, I almost said Cliff Barrows a minute ago, because we have interviewed him, George Beverly Shea. But a great illustration of the fact that here is somebody who is with Jesus and actually was on the earth for such a long period of time, and gives us, of course, the gospel. He gives us the revelation. He gives us epistles. They're, apart from Paul, the most significant individual in terms of the scriptural content that we have.
Yes.
And as a result, you had so much to work with, because you're talking about the first words he hears, come and see, then the one we just played, the bread of life, and the one who was sent, and so many great pieces of material and musical pieces that you've used that have come from the Gospel of John.
Well, there's a good chance that he is Jesus' first cousin. And by that I mean his mother is Salome, and Salome is Mary's sister. And you get that by looking at the list of the three women at the tomb. There's a third woman. In one passage in Mark, she's Salome. In Matthew, she's referred to as the mother of Zebedee's children. And in John, I think 19, she's referred to as his mother's sister. So if that third woman is the same person, then, I mean, John, the writer of the Gospel of John, is Jesus' first cousin.
Isn't
and
that
I
something?
think that is amazing.
I think so, too. And I did not pick up on that either. So just some fascinating stuff that we can find in the book of the Nazarene. Let me take another phone call. And, I guess we've lost that caller, but I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about some of those issues. So maybe we can get back into that a little bit, because here we have so many of the illustrations, the bread of life, the light of the world, many of these other things which are used. Oftentimes, John uses a statement, a parable, a story, a phraseology to tie together, because his goal is not to try to give it all chronologically, but to have it face and really kind of interact with some of the themes. And that shows up in some of the things that you've written music about.
Yeah, and that makes it all makes perfect sense. I mean, think about this. John has been preaching about this for 60, 70 years. And so John has what we call a high Christology. Jesus is the Word, and Jesus is the bread of life, and Jesus is the way. And that comes as a result of the fact that John has been preaching about who Jesus is for decades, remembering all these things that Jesus has said about himself. You don't get that in Mark. I mean, obviously Jesus is the Son of God, and there's a high Christ. I mean, he's the Christ in all the Gospels. But the presentation of Jesus in John is a very high Christology. And I think that's because John's been preaching this stuff. Jesus is the wisdom of God. That's my favorite theme in John. He loves this idea that Jesus is the Word, and the Word, is misunderstood. Anytime Jesus speaks something significant in John, he's misunderstood because he's the wisdom of God.
Yes. One of the things I thought I would pick out is Scribbling in the Sand. First of all, of course, that was the title of one of your books. It's chapter 37 in the book. And, of course, it has to do with, of course, the woman caught in adultery. Now, we have questions as to whether that was in the original. We'll put that aside. But it's nevertheless a great opportunity to see that twice John talks about Jesus knelt down and wrote down something with his fingertips in the sacred sand of the temple. Speak to that, if you might.
Yeah. Well, I think that if you look in the Hebrew Bible, we have what is called prophetic activity. And the prophets will do these bizarre things to get people's attention. And I think what Jesus did in the temple, I think that was prophetic activity because it clearly got their attention. And like you said, he did it twice. And here is this angry group of Pharisees with this woman. And I mean, they're probably hoping that she's going to be stoned by the end of the day. And Jesus doesn't address them right away. He kneels down. And interestingly, Herod is rebuilding the temple at this point, and there's dirt everywhere. There would be piles of sand everywhere. So even that detail matches up. And John, here's one of my big beefs with John. He doesn't tell us what he wrote. Would you not love to know what he wrote?
I know. And I've seen films where people have him writing things, and everybody's guessing because we have no idea. But you're right. It may have been like what was asked of Jeremiah and others to do some of these bizarre things that the prophets had to do. And it was just a way to get everybody's attention. It may not have been writing something that anybody could even read. Now, it might have been, but we just don't know. And if nothing else, it's just a really striking element in that story of the woman caught in adultery.
Well, we have two ancient variant readings in old manuscripts. One manuscript said that he was writing names, and the people were seeing their names written in the sand. And another variant says that he was writing sins, and people were seeing their sins. And I think these are just people trying to come up with something. I trust the original enough to say that John doesn't think what he wrote is as significant as the fact that he did it. Yes. He did this kind of outrageous. He's ignoring these people who are very important, very powerful people, and just writing in the sand. I mean, it was infuriating.
I would think it's like somebody today, if you're yelling at them and they're just looking at their phone, it's the same kind of idea. Well,
that's good. And I love that Jesus did that sort of stuff. I love it that he did that.
Well, I wish we had more time, but again, it always goes so quickly when we have you. But let me just mention, if people want to connect up with you, we have a link to michaelcard.com. That's simple enough. You can find out various events. You can follow the podcast. There's a nice video there. If people want to know more about the books, music, all sorts of things, it's all at michaelcard.com. And it has been a delight to have you on the program. And thank you for writing so many books, but especially this one, The Nazarene. It really resonated with us, and I appreciate you being on Point of View.
Well, thanks for taking the time to have me on. God bless you.
Looking forward to the next opportunity. Michael Card with us. Okay, we're back to the news tomorrow, and that's when we will get into some more issues. We have David French with us. We have Jim Dennison with us. I'm going to try to make a little more sense out of some of the things unfolding right now in the Middle East, some things happening here in this country, but we're just simply out of time. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.